Hello everyone, this is FIDE Viktor Neustroev. In this video I'm going to demonstrate one of the main lines of Paulsen variation in Sicilian defense. Okay, let's start. e4 c5, knight f3 e6, this is how Paulsen variation starts. Actually, if you want to play Sicilian, you should also start with this move order. d4, c takes d4 and knight takes d4, and in this position there are two most common moves. Some people also play knight f6, but knight f6 leads to some different variations. If you want to play Sicilian, here you continue with a6. However, in this course we are talking about Paulsen or Taimanov variation. Knight c6 is the move that starts the Paulsen variation. What happens then? Knight c3, the most common response, queen c7, bishop e3, and here I would like to analyze the line when white castles to the king side. So if, for example, instead of this move they play knight b5, you can successfully escape with your queen to b8, and then chase this knight away with a6 b5. So bishop e3, a6, bishop e2, and knight f6. As for a6, this is a helpful move. It not only prevents the enemy pieces coming to b5, but also allows you to play b5 in future. And castle. Bishop e7, f4. They are going to fight for the e5 square. You can't ignore it. Once white plays e5, you experience serious problems with the knight on f6. You can't just find a good spot for that knight. That's why here d6 is obligatory. And if speaking about this position, you can reach it with three different variations. Of course, with Paulsen, the line that I demonstrate you in this course. You can also reach it with Sicilian if you slightly change the move order, and usually it comes after playing the Scheveningen variation. What is the most common move for white in this position? They usually start with queen e1 with the idea to relocate the queen to g3 and pressure on the g7 square, as well as to control the e5 square with the queen on g3. However, if, for example, something like a4 is played to prevent b5 activity, then the line will be transposed to the Sicilian variation, because this is a very common move in this position for Sicilian. And this is the line I demonstrated in my Sicilian course. However, let me just explain what can typically happen. For example, castle, queen e1, and after that, one of the best plans is to capture on d4 and play e5. What happens then? This is how you can simplify the position in the center to finish your piece's development and at the same time to avoid a kingside attack. For example, if f takes e5, d takes e5, your next move is bishop e6. So let's say here queen g3 to create a pin. Then you can solve all your problems with only one move. Can you please find this move? If you need, you can pause this video and find the move that saves white position. Okay, so the pawn is hanging. Playing something like that is a blunder due to knight d5, fork. The only move here is bishop c5, but this move is enough to equalize everything. The bishop is pinned. The e5 is not hanging. In case of queen e5, then we just take the queen, and they have no time to capture on f6 because this bishop on d4 is hanging. For example, if bishop takes e5, then queen c5 is a check. After king h1, we have enough time to move the king to h8 to prevent white from capturing this knight on f6. So the position is equal. And practically, I would say black would have better chances to outplay white. In case if bishop e3, then you should apply another typical solution of how to simplify the position when you play Sicilian. You should capture on f4 and bishop f4, and then your next move is bishop e6 with the with this perfect idea to relocate the knight to e5, because the knight on e5 is the best minor piece in the position. Moreover, it covers the weakness on d6, which cannot be attacked with diagonal attacks such as queen on g3 and from bishop on f4. Anytime white decides to play this move, it's okay just to capture with the bishop. And then you still should relocate the knight to e5. Let's say they continue with queen g3, because now knight d7 no longer works. The pawn is hanging. No, not yet, but it will be. Here you should first play queen c5 check, and after king h1, play either knight d7, knight e5, which in my opinion is the best, or continue with knight h5, forcing them to capture on h5, and then they take on d6, where you have a full compensation for the pawn that you sacrifice. However, I kindly recommend you not to play knight h5, but to continue with the most solid response here, knight d7, knight e5, and after that your position can be even better. Okay, so that was the move a4 and what you can typically play after a4. Let's now stick to the main line, which is queen e1. Castle. No, black finishes their development, and their plan is to take and then either to play e5 or to play b5. So queen g3, now after knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, e5 no longer works. We just don't have enough defenders. What should we do in such a case? Well, one of the most common plans is bishop d7, bishop c6, but that was quite popular in the past. Nowadays it's much better just to play b5 with the idea of b4 and of course bishop d7. Bishop b7, I mean. a3. Now bishop b7. So black finally finished their piece's development and the game enters the middle game stage. And what typical plans white have? They should attack on the king side. This is the only thing they have, but I want you to remember that here black has a huge defensive potential. So if you don't make any serious mistakes, you are unlikely to lose the game. Always keep it in mind when you play either Sicilian or Paulsen Sicilian. So, for example, king h1 is a prophylaxis to avoid any complications with this diagonal, or rook a to e1, which is likely to lead to the same position. Rook a e1, rook a d8, bishop d3, rook f e8, and this just transposes to the main line. Let me illustrate you how to deal with it in a different move order. When king h1 is played first, you centralize the rooks. You have two ideas in this position. One is to play d5, the other one is to play e5, and you should be quite flexible. So you should always decide what is better. For example, here d5 doesn't make much sense. It opens this bishop attack. And after e5 you have to decide what to do with this knight. However, I think knight e4 is not so bad in this case, but it's up to you. So let's say rook a to e1. However, if first they continue with e5, I kindly recommend you to capture the pawn. The bishop has to take because now it's under the attack. So pawn takes, you just capture there. They take here, but it shouldn't be a big problem for you because you can exchange the queens and capture on f6 successfully. Okay, so bishop e5, queen to c5, and what then? They have several moves. They can play this, they can play bishop d3, or just speed up the attack with f5 move. However, in all these three cases, your position is much better. For example, if they play this move, you continue with g6, and after bishop d3, I'll just explain you how to deal with it in a different move order. If, let's say, they continue with f5, which deserves attention, then you can simply simplify the position with just bishop d6, exchanging the most attacking bishop here. They have to take, otherwise you gain the bishop because it's pinned. Bishop d6, rook d6, protecting on e6. And then black has a full order. No problems at all. If we go back and continue with bishop d3, which is a natural move, because h7 will be under the attack, and this is the best place for the bishop. g6. I know this move weakens dark squares. However, you are able to cover them with such ideas like rook e8, bishop f8, bishop g7, or with knight h5. They can't fully take the advantage of these squares being weakened. For example, if they continue with f5, you can just simply play this move, get rid of the queen, because the queen has to stay somewhere to protect on e5, so probably it's e1, because I don't see any other good spot. Then you just take on f5, and because there is no pin, you gain the pawn for free. So f5 is a critical mistake for white in this position. If they join the rook, knight h5. Let's say queen h3, but even with queen h3, they don't threaten with g4 move, because the g pawn is pinned. Please keep it in mind. So what do you think? What black should do then to prevent future attack from white? How would you play? At this moment, it's very important to understand the position, not to just calculate the lines and look for possible move, but to understand your defensive resources. And such move here is f5. f5 offers more space for you. So if, for example, it's required, you can protect the h7 with your rook move. It also restricts queen and bishop activity. Yes, it all has disadvantages. For example, the e6 pawn becomes a backward pawn, but this is the only disadvantage. Moreover, you can always protect this pawn with bishop d5. Of course, I don't want you to exchange the bishop for a knight, but after you get rid of the knight, you can do that. So f5, and here the white's attack came to a dead end. Our position is safe, the only weakness is on e6, but white can't take the advantage of this weakness, and they are most likely to lose the pawn on f4 in case if they try. You see, at the moment, there is no square for the bishop to move out to attack the pawn, but even if they find, we can just move the queen to c6, move the queen to b6, or play rook d6 to support it. It's up to you. Okay, let's go back. That was e5 move, which didn't work in this exact position, but could work maybe later in the game. Rook a e1. Rook f to e8. So you activate the rook as well. What then? No, here bishop d3 is the main move, but let's try e5 again. D takes e5, so the bishop is still under the attack, so bishop takes e5. This time queen c5 no longer makes sense because the queen is not attacking this bishop. After bishop d3, this rook will be protecting it. That's why queen c8, to secure here. Bishop d3, and of course you should continue with g6 move. What then? Two moves that white can play are f5 and queen h3. Let's start with queen h3 first. If they play such a move, I kindly recommend you to play knight d7. But knight d7 is a kind of a trick. So first of all, you are freeing the bishop, and second, you attract them into this sacrifice. So bishop g6, it's a kind of a trap. This sacrifice doesn't work, however, looks very attractive. For example, if this sacrifice is played, of course you can't do this because of a checkmate on h8. You have to take with the f pawn, then queen e6, and the king has only one spot here. But how to continue the attack? The only thing I see, because you are going to play knight f6 or bishop f6 to exchange everything, the only thing I see is f5, trying to open the position. But then you have bishop f6 move. So you remember I told you you have enough defensive resources. Bishop f6 is a queen attack. Queen d6, check. They have to play this move, for example. If something like that, just king g7 is enough. So queen d6 check, king goes to g8, and if now bishop f6, knight takes f6, and looks like white gained a minor piece back. That's true, but now they experience serious problems with the g2 square. You see, after rook d2, they are in trouble. Now black has a counterattack, and the position is in their favor. So that's why knight d7 looks very attractive, because you with this move you set a trap. If they don't get trapped, for example, if they continue the attack with a natural rook lift, you can simply play bishop f8, and now e6 is protected, so bishop g6 no longer worked. This is how you just exchange the knight for a bishop and then relocate your bishop from g7. For example, queen h4, knight takes e5, f takes e5, and bishop g7. You have two strong bishops. Their attack no longer works. Even if they continue with rook h3, you can always play h5 or h6. It's up to you. Even if they somehow take on h7, there is no checkmate. Don't worry, it's just a pawn. Okay, let's go back. That was a queen h3 move in this position. Let's now talk about the second option, which is f5. Well, f5, it takes f5. Bishop takes f5, the g-pawn is pinned, it's obvious. But now you can also move your queen with a temper. You are not threatening to take on g2 at the moment, but you may consider it, because in this case you sacrifice your bishop for a pawn, then exchange the queens, and then make the f5 bishop hanging. So keep it in mind. However, after bishop retreats to d3, then bishop g2 no longer makes sense, but knight h5 is good. Queen f2, they have to keep the queen defending on g2. However, after you continue with f6, you no longer experience any problems. For example, bishop moves there, you can just exchange. If bishop goes there, you can just continue with this move and exchange rooks. It's up to you. So by exchanging pieces, you simplify the position, and the chance to get a checkmate becomes so low. And if you want to draw, of course you have it, you just need to change a few pieces. If you're playing for a win, I would recommend you to keep the position more complicated with more pieces on the board. Okay, let's go back. We covered e5 in this exact position, which didn't work and didn't offer any prospects for white. Let's now talk about bishop d3. After this move, there is also one thing I want you to remember. So your goal is to play e5. Because if you imagine the pawn is stable on e5, this bishop will be blocked. The other bishop will be blocked as well by their own pawn. That's why I recommend you to play rook d7. This is how you protect the queen. And also intend to play bishop d8, so you vacate the square to be able to join another defender to the e5. What can be done in this position for white? There are several plans. Some of them are analyzed in model games. But let's talk about the main. So knight d1 with the idea to relocate the knight is the first move. Queen h3. Pressuring e6 and h7. Rook f3, a typical rook lift, and another rook lift is rook e3. Let's start with knight d1 move first. You stick to the plan, bishop d8, and your next move is e5, so that's why they have to play e5. D takes e5, bishop takes e5, queen c6, attacking on g2. Bishop e4. You see, it's impossible to take because you get a checkmate on g7, so you have only one option to retreat. Knight f2, And with g6 move, you eliminate this bishop activity. The best thing they have, because you are threatening knight takes e4, and then maybe bishop takes e4. So the best thing for them is just to take on b7, and after queen b7, the position becomes approximately equal. If you want, we can continue the line. For example, let's say bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, knight e4, bishop d4 in this position. I'm not sure about bishop b2 move. I consider it to be so risky because c3 can be played, and after c3 it's difficult to cover the weakness of f6. So bishop d4 or bishop g7, d4 looks better. And if now they decide to continue with this move, you can just simply play queen c7 with the idea of exchanging the queens. After you exchange the queens, there is no prospects for the kingside attack for white. What they can do? Not much. So let's say they continue with what? Queen g4? But queen g4, h5. And if queen g5, you take there, and if rook takes there, you just double, and they lose the material due to this pin. Okay, let's go back. Let's, instead of queen g4, play something like that, c3. After c3 move, let's just exchange the queens first and then move the bishop back. f6 is not a big problem because you can activate the bishop through h6, and then maybe d2, c1 are the squares that you may occupy later in the game after you exchange rooks. If f takes e6, just rook takes e6, and these simplifications are in black favor actually. Rook takes e6, f takes e6, knight e4, and a5 with the idea of b4 pressuring the pawn on b2. So the position is approximately equal. There is not much white can do, and if, for example, we decide who have more chances to succeed in this game, I would say it's black because of their bishop and because they have the attack of the pawns located on dark squares with b4 move. e6 is a weakness. If the pawn was on f5, it was better, but maybe it can be just a passed pawn. So the position is approximately equal, maybe slightly better chances for black to succeed. Let's go back. It was knight d1 plan. So in this position, knight d1. Now let's talk about the second option, which is queen h3. If queen h3 is played, I am sure you know how to deal with it, because the queen moved out from g3, it no longer supports e5, that's why we should play e5. If not, then they will play e5 and attack h7. What can be done in this position? This is one of the options, but the other one is to retreat with the bishop. Let's say there, just to a safe square. So then bishop d8 with the idea to open the e file. And if rook lift, then you can just double. You'll be threatening to take here. For example, rook g3, it takes f4, rook takes f4. Right now this is not hanging, but you can just play this move with the idea of knight h5 or rook h5, up to you. You see, they joined all major pieces into the attack, but they have no ideas of how to continue the attack. Moreover, you have a chance to trap the queen or just to gain the exchange, up to you. So anyway, it's difficult to continue the attack for white. In Paulsen variation, in this concrete variation, white usually starts the attack on the king side, but black should be looking for a counterplay in the center. The position is sharp with a lot of tactical options. That's why I can say that you can play this position for 3 results. So this is the opening that you when you may play for a win even with black pieces. Okay, the next option is Rook Lift with the F Rook. Quite a natural move, and one of the model games is devoted to this variation, but you still stick to the plan with bishop d8. What now? Queen h3 or f5 immediately? Let's start with queen h3 move first. Of course, e5, f takes e5, d takes e5, the bishop has to move out. And to secure your position, you should play g6 with the idea of knight h5, knight f4. For example, rook e to f1, bishop c8, creating a discovered attack. Queen moves to g3 and falls under the attack of the knight. Queen f2, they are pressuring here, but they don't have enough resources to take at the moment. Just bishop b7. And with bishop b7, you keep the ideas of playing f5. If, for example, we continue with bishop h6, f5 right now is too risky, they can even sacrifice the exchange, you'd better play knight f4. Looks like a pawn sacrifice, but you have a bishop pair that can compensate it. For example, bishop f4, it takes f4, and rook takes f4, then bishop g5. Rook comes back, rook e5. And after queen g3, you just play this move, and with a bishop pair, you have a full compensation for the pawns that you sacrificed, and I don't see any prospects of the kingside attack, and I don't actually see any winning move that white may have here. Okay, let's go back. That was queen h3 move. Now let's talk about f5. f5, e5 anyway, because your main task was to stop the light squared bishop attack. This bishop goes to e3 and threatens with this, which is not a big problem, but you'd better do some prophylaxis with king h8 move. What then? Bishop g5 or queen h3 probably. Let's talk about both options. Bishop g5, knight to g8. What happens then? They can either retreat or they can push the pawn. Pushing the pawn is actually an inaccuracy, and you can prove that you're winning here. Let's start with bishop d2 move first. Bishop d2, knight goes back. And if queen h3 now, then what did I tell you about a counterplay that you should obtain here? Yes, you're right, you should open the position in the center, and here you do it with a d5, which is a perfect breakthrough in the center. So it's up to you whether to take on e4 or just to push the pawn to d4. Both lines are good. But I believe after you play d5, everyone will capture. What is important to know? Of course, it's always good to capture with the knight, but in this case, it's too risky due to f6. The bishop attack on h7 opens, so that's why sometimes you have to keep the knight on f6 just to blockade the pawn on f5, which doesn't allow white to join this bishop into the attack and create some problems. So you have to take with the bishop here, and here with the rook to keep the knight on f6. Let's say bishop c3. So you can play e4, but queen d7. Now you may play this move, because this rook is protected. That's why the pawn on e4 is no longer pinned. Let's say they move the rook to prevent us from playing e4, but we can play bishop b6, attacking this rook. Rook should move back, after which your position is good. You can consider e4 after that. And if, let's say, rook captures e5, what is the most natural response, then rook takes rook, bishop takes e5, and here you get a better position after which move? What do you think? How black should play in this position to get a better position? Right now, black lost a pawn. So the task is not only to lose the pawn, but to improve the position in general. Okay, so that's right. You should take the advantage of the pin on the e file. Bishop d4. 2 on pin, they can only play bishop g3. If, for example, instead they decide to play queen g3, you just reinforce the attack and they no longer has this move, bishop to g3. Okay, let's go back and continue with the natural response, then just this, attacking the pawn on a3. For example, rook takes rook, queen takes rook, the bishop has to stay to control the first rank, a3 is a weakness, and white is in the trouble actually. Yes, they still have a bishop pair, but actually they can't benefit from it, at least at this position, because the bishop on d3 is restricted. You restrict it with your b5 pawn and the f5 pawn that you stop with the knight on f6. Okay, so let's go back. That was bishop d2 in this position. What if now they try to play f6? Well, black should just boldly take the sacrificed pawn on f6. Bishop takes here, knight takes here, what else they can do? The only option, I believe, is just to sacrifice the exchange to be able to activate the knight. But every time they move the knight to d5, you always capture it with the bishop. However, this time e takes d5 opens the bishop attack, and this is actually quite annoying, but keep in mind that you have an extra exchange at the moment, one extra exchange and extra pawn. So you're able to defend your position with your rook moves. Attacking here, queen d8, and the position looks good. If they attack here, you have rook g7. If they play something like that to capture on f6, that's fine. You exchange the queens. There is no checkmate anymore, and with two rooks versus rook and bishop, you are able to succeed. So white attack doesn't work, while black has the material advantage. Let's go back. That was f6 here, and we covered bishop g5 variation. Let's now talk about queen h3. However, I'm sure you remember that after the queen moves out, you can just open the position in the center. And this time, while nobody attacks this knight, you can push the pawn to e4 right away. And they have to find a tempo move, otherwise they just lose a minor piece. For example, this move. Queen has to retreat, taking the control over the f5 and of course the back rank. What then? If, let's say, knight takes e4, just bishop d5 works pretty well, and the knight is pinned. So knight f6 is not a check anymore when the king is on h8, and they just blunder a rook. If they continue with rook e3 to double and to get rid of the pin, then bishop takes e4. And if in this position bishop takes here, you just exchange everything on e4 and deliver a back rank mate with rook d1. So in this position, they have to play something like that to secure the back rank. And unfortunately, you can't move the bishop out due to this pin, but you can reinforce your bishop on e4. Bishop d6. How to solve the problem now? What do you think? Because if you move this bishop, you still lose on e7. Here the best move is bishop g2, check. If queen takes, they just lose. If king takes, everything is protected. But rook a3, rook takes a3, and after you exchange, you can simply continue with queen c6, check, and capture a minor piece for free. So this is where black is winning. Okay. So I just want you to know that here knight e4 doesn't work. Instead, it should be rook f to e3 immediately, with these knights being on the board. Bishop d5, knight takes d5, rook takes d5. So you took a pawn. Now the material is equal, and the e4 is not hanging due to the back rank mate. However, they can reinforce the attack of the e4 with such a weird move like queen f3. And you see, you can't capture the queen, it's not a blunder because of a rook e8, which leads to a checkmate. But you can play bishop b6 to provoke them to take with the rook on e4. For example, if just the rook retreats, you can capture the queen in this case. So rook takes e4, they sacrifice the exchange, but then they have two strong bishops, and the best thing you can do, actually in this position, the best thing you can do is rook f5. Yeah, rook f5, exactly. Rook f5, and the bishop is pinned. And if rook f4, it's still rook f5. Because after they take on e8, you capture with the queen, you will be threatening with a mate in case if a bishop from d3 captures the rook on f5. So here you have extra exchange and you just gain the pawn on f5. For example, if we continue with queen e2, rook takes e4, queen takes e4, they are threatening with a mate. On h7, you should consider something like that. Let's say g6, then g4 to reinforce the attack, but rook c5. But maybe here you have to sacrifice the exchange, because if you just play an ordinary move like that, they exchange on b6 and deliver a check on d4, which is a fork to the king and this rook. So here you have to sacrifice the exchange, but move the king to a safe place. Bishop c5, queen c5, threatening a mate. And this position with equal material is better for black due to some attacking chances because of this dark squared bishop, which is quite active, while his opponent, the light squared bishop of white, is blocked and restricted with b5 and g6 pawns. The queen can't do much alone, so black is better, and black is playing for a win. Let's go back. That was rook f to e3 in this position. Let's now go back, and looks like we covered queen h3 line, and bishop g5 was covered before. So instead of playing f5 here, let's... Oh, okay. So the line of rook f3 was already covered. Let's now stick to the main line, which is rook e3. However, I can say that actually rook f3 and rook e3 are approximately similar, and they both can be considered as main lines. And of course, you know what to do. It's bishop d8, because your main plan was to play e5. What now? They should play e5. Otherwise, you play e5. For example, rook e to f3 and e5 by black. F takes e5, d takes e5. What then? Bishop retreats. Queen c6 to protect on f6. What can be done then? There are two things that white can do. Well, actually, three things. If they, for example, continue with bishop h6, attacking here, just g6 with a counterplay. Knight h5, knight f4 in future. And the queen, if it stays on the king side, becomes the object of the attack, while f7 is well protected with your d7 rook. Another move is queen h3, but queen h3 allows you to simplify the position with queen e6, because exchanging queens is in your favor, your pieces are more active, and these two bishops are not doing something helpful for white position. If rook f5 to keep attacking with queens on the board, then you should continue with rook c7. And then I think the attack ends. And black position is quite comfortable. So here you may consider playing g6 in future. Another good idea is to sacrifice on c3 and capture on e4. If you decide to relocate the queen, then d6 and c6 are the best spots. I would say the position is approximately equal. Okay, if instead of queen h3 here, they continue with a4 to undermine our pawns on the queen side, b4 looks good, but b takes a4 works as well. Rook a1, now they are not putting the pressure here, that's why we may use the bishop. So rook f6, queen f6 is fine, there is no other rook on f1. So in this position, if knight a4, you can just simply continue with bishop b4. The bishop is no longer the object of the attack, and every time the knight retreats, you can capture it. So with bishop b4, you also cover the c5 square. So white has no chances to continue their initiative here. They can probably continue with this move, but rook c7 is good enough. Okay, let's go back and analyze the main line where white decides to play e5, which is the most typical move here. D takes e5, what's then? This bishop is still hanging, so the bishop has to take, after which you play queen b6. This is how you take this rook under your control. What may happen then? They can move the queen to h3, maybe knight e4, closer to the king side, or continue with f5. These are three typical ways to reinforce the attack. Let's talk about knight e4. Knight a4, knight h5. And if queen h3, just g6. Playing something like that is too risky due to the pin. What can be done? Oh, of course, we are going to analyze this move. The other move is b4. So let's start with g4. Knight goes back. And after g5, you can just continue with this move. Every time they play knight f6, you just take on f6. Let's say rook e2. Then I kindly recommend you to undermine the position. It looks like you give the g5 square for the knight, but it's fine. Every time they move, you capture with your bishop. For example, king h7, rook g2, they close the diagonal, and they are about to play something like that. Or maybe something like that after they get rid of the knight. But just f5. And now white has to define where to locate their knight. So something like this is a blunder due to bishop g5, knight f6 no longer works. The knight should retreat to d2, but this time you can exchange the bishops to get your king to a safe position. So I don't want you to take immediately, because you lose this good bishop and you still allow them to pressure on the g file. Because with this pin, nobody can attack on g6. Even if they double, the rook is still pinned and can't capture. Knight f3, then rook g8. And what then? So you're about to play this move. If b3, just something ordinary, you capture there. And after f takes e6, just capture here. The position is in black favor, of course. The king is pretty safe. There is nothing that can be done on the h file. And always remember about the pin. So you can even consider playing g5 and g4. which may be too risky, but if white loses 2 tempers or at least 1 temper, then I think it works. Okay, now let's go back. That was a sharp move g4, which leads to a better position for black. Now b4. b4 looks good with the idea to prevent the queenside attack like that, which is a typical idea for Sicilian and Paulsen Sicilian as well. It also restricts our dark squared bishop. Bishop e7, bishop e2, attacking here. And this is where you can take on e4. So white doesn't have a chance to make any threats here. Rook takes e4 and you just retreat. If, let's say, rook goes away, you just continue with rook c8, pressuring c2, and if c3, just queen d8. For example, bishop f3, bishop d6, and you exchange the bishops. You see, if this move, you just take on f4. If they decide to take on f6, which is a more natural move, bishop takes f6, and let's say f5 in this position. Well, this bishop is hanging on f6 in case if the f-pawn moves. That's why let's decide of how to protect it. With king g7, you can do it f takes g6 or f takes e6. You capture on e6 with a rook in this case. So here h takes g6, and the idea of king g7 is not only to secure the f6, but also to play rook h8 and attack h2. What happens then? For example, if they move the queen to f3, you continue with e5. With this move, you support the bishop. For example, c4, b takes c4, bishop takes there, but here just bishop g5 can be played, and then you move this pawn out. Right now, for example, the pawn cannot be taken. Well, if they take it, you should continue with this move, and then the bishop is lost. Oh, you can also say, okay, and what about something like maybe this move or maybe that move? Then rook f7. And if they capture there, you block on f6. If they exchange and then realize that they can capture, actually not, you can checkmate on f1. So it doesn't work, and after bishop g5, you just simply move the pawn to f6 or f5, it's up to you. Okay, let's go back. Let's say instead of queen to f3 in this position, what if they continue with rook e to f4? If so, rook h8 anyway, and if now queen f3, you see they have so many pieces attacking, you can still get rid of this problem and avoid any complications. What do you think? Which move in this position helps black to solve all their problems? If you need, you can pause this video and then decide. Okay, we continue. So moving the bishop means to blunder on f7, and if we keep the bishop on f6, we lose that bishop. But there is one trick we can do, it's queen c7, and the rook is pinned. h3 to avoid a checkmate, but bishop e5 and f7 is well protected. After that, you play f5 and your position is fine. So the rook probably moves here, which I think is the only move. And then f5, the rook has to retreat, and your position looks quite good. Okay, let's go back. So that was a b4 move, g4 was covered. And let's now talk about f5 instead of knight e4. All these lines we will analyze under knight e4 variations. So let's now talk about f5 immediately. What can be done then? Bishop c7, This is a quite familiar trick to exchange the bishops, because it's pinned. What can be done? For example, if they play rook f2 e1 to reinforce, you just take on e5, rook takes e5, and continue with queen d6, so the rook is still pinned. If they capture, you capture with your rook, rook takes rook, pawn takes e6. Please keep it in mind. Yeah, you're gonna have a kind of a weakness on e6, but you can protect it with your king on f7 after you exchange the queens. If f takes e6 in this position, then queen takes e6. There are two pins. So how to get rid of it? Just take on f6 with the rook. No, the g pawn is pinned. Taking with the queen means to lose the queen. No, I'll just show you. So this is a blunder, because then bishop e6, and if you decide to capture the queen, you get a checkmate. So it's just a queen loss. But the best move here is queen takes e5, so you sacrifice the queen. However, this sacrifice works perfectly. For example, bishop takes on e5, and what then? So you are about to get two rooks for a queen, even in case if you capture there. Always remember about the back rank weakness. So if something like that, which is a blunder, just take there, then take here, and if they take, you checkmate. That's why the best response here is to sacrifice the bishop first, with the idea to move the queen out in case if king takes, but the king shouldn't take. The king should move to f8. Now, what? Two pieces are hanging, so they sacrifice the rook. Rook takes f7, and then move the queen somewhere. The main advantage of white in this position is that they got two extra pawns. However, it's not so easy. g6. The bishop is trapped, so if they don't want to lose it, they have to take on g6. If queen takes g6, it's rook f1. So bishop takes g6. But now bishop c3, and you're threatening with rook e1. What to do? If queen takes c3, it's just rook f1. Rook f7, still this move. So what to do? Probably h3? Oh yeah, let's say h3 in this position, but rook e1, king h2, and now bishop e5, you force them to block, after which you deliver a checkmate on h1. So this is an absolutely winning position. That's why this queen sacrifice works. And that's why in this position they shouldn't capture the queen immediately. They should move the rook back to support on e3. But then bishop takes f3. Now rook e5 works. Bishop takes e5. It's a kind of a trap, but even without this trap, black is doing good. Let's say queen takes f3. What else? If they just move the queen, your position is perfect. For example, if they continue maybe with this move, you can just retreat and protect. So you may say, okay, and how to deal with this? It's not a problem. They can't even capture here. Your king escapes. So if queen f3, a trap, bishop c3, and if now they decide to capture, you know what to do. Rook d3, and the first rank is weak. They have to play something to secure it. You can capture even the second pawn. Okay, fine. That was f5 move in this position. Now let's talk about queen h3, which is a part of our main line. Queen h3, h7 becomes weak. That's why g6, So this is a typical move for Paulsen and Sicilian positions. Usually we relocate the bishop to g7, but here the bishop is good on d8 because you can either exchange the bishops with bishop c7, or sometimes it protects the queen on c7. Rook g3, queen c5. This is a very nice move that allows your queen to get to f8 if needed. For example, or to f8 or to e7. For example, b4, queen f8. What else they can do? I don't believe white can succeed with the king side attack anymore. So if they play something on the queen side like that, you can capture on b4, but maybe it's too risky at the moment. Let's take there. And if b5, a takes b5, bishop b5, they create a pin. So you have to face with some material losses, but it's not a big problem. Rook d2, because g2 plays the most important role here. So the bishop on b7 is quite powerful here. What happens then? For example, if they decide to take, you capture with the queen, you attack g2, you have a pass pawn on the a file, and the full compensation for the exchange you sacrificed. If they don't take, but capture on a4, knight h5. So this is how you're winning the material back. Rook comes to g4, knight f6 is okay, and you can repeat the position if you want. If bishop takes f6, then bishop takes f6, bishop e8, and after queen e8, these two bishops compensate the loss of the exchange. c2 is hanging, queen c6 is another threat, so it's difficult for white even to make a move. Black is even better in this position. Okay, so let's go back. That was a b4 move that you can face. I just want you not only to learn the move order, but also to remember the ideas. Queen h4, queen e7 to support, and now actually you are threatening with knight a4, which is a discovered attack. For example, queen takes queen, knight takes g3 is a check, and only after that you capture the queen on e7. If rook h3 with the threat of doing bishop f6 and queen to h7, you can just continue with this move. The g-pawn is pinned. Please always remember about it. This is where black's position is quite comfortable. If the queen retreats, you can decide whether to play f6 or f5. Maybe f6 first, bishop goes away, and then f5. This position, I would say, is approximately equal. Maybe black is just a bit better, with better chances to play due to the pawn on f5, which controls these two important squares. So the plan for black is to play knight f6 and knight g4, attacking the queen, and actually g4 is generally a good spot for the knight. If they try to prevent us from playing it and continue with bishop e2, then you can enter the enemy camp with your rook on d2, because I believe this bishop on d4 won't stay forever. It's likely to move to e5. Okay, so that was a long line, and this is one of the main lines of Paulsen variation. So at least from this video you learned how successfully defend your position, and that your position has already a huge defensive potential. There are not so many prospects for white kingside attack. Always remember about the bishop activity on b7 and try to stick to the main plan, which is to play e5 here. So you prepare e5 with such moves like rook d8, rook e8, rook d7, and bishop to d8, because after you play e5, your position becomes already better, because this is how you stop both bishop activity. That was FIDE Master Viktor Neustroev. In the next video, we are going to proceed with model games.